Perhaps the most important misperception about the Oslo process is that it is or was a peace process, a two-sided affair, a matter of give and take, in which each side's promises depended on the fulfillment of the other side's promises. My view is that it was a kind of unilateral Israeli withdrawal. But Oslo pretended to be something else, a peace process. Israeli officials knew that Oslo lacked mutuality, but they evidently believed they had to tell the public, to mislead the public about the relationship of withdrawal to peace. And the general's remarks, I think, gave some particulars to support that point. Top officials in the Rabin government were clear about their priorities. Peace was important, and trading land for peace might be useful, but most important of all was reducing the burdens of the occupation. Even if Israel didn't have the power to win peace from the Palestinians, it had the power to quit the territories on its own. As we'll see, the idea of unilateral withdrawal had some appeal in Israel long before the first Oslo agreement. And years later, after Oslo was widely discredited by the terrorism that the Palestinian Authority incited and often perpetrated, unilateral withdrawal had even more support. Unlike the early Oslo redeployments, Israel's 2005 departure from Gaza was nakedly unilateral. It made no pretense of being a land for peace deal. By then, there was far less belief among Israelis that a land for peace deal with the PA was achievable. Now, I served as a low-ranking Middle East specialist at the White House in the Reagan administration, and much later as a senior Defense Department official in the George W. Bush administration, and I'll tell you a few stories relevant to the Oslo process from both of those periods. Early on, I recognized that Oslo was more about Israeli withdrawal than about peace. One of the reasons I was aware of this was something that happened long before that first Rabin-Arafat handshake on the White House South Lawn. 12 years before the September 1993 Oslo Agreement, during the first year of the Reagan administration, I was a National Security Council staff member. Yossi Beilin, at the time an aide to Shimon Peres, who was the opposition leader, Beilin came to Washington as the guest of the U.S. Information Agency as part of a program to cultivate friendly relations with promising young foreign leaders. Beilin's itinerary included a meeting at the White House, and I was assigned to talk to him. Mr. Peres had recently published an article in Foreign Affairs that Beilin was generally assumed to have written. So I asked him about it. The article made the well-known argument that if Israel continued to hold the territories, the state could not survive as both Jewish and democratic. But the article said Israel should withdraw from the territories only if it received reliable Arab peace pledges. I commented that there was an inconsistency here. Mr. Peres said that it would be suicidal for Israel to hold the territories, but Israel shouldn't give them up without peace. If your Arab neighbors refuse to give you peace, I asked, does Mr. Peres believe Israel should commit suicide by continuing to hold the territories? Beilin broke out into a beaming smile and said he was always amazed that so few people noticed that inconsistency. The reasoning makes no sense, he said, and that's why, he declared to me, I'm in favor of unilateral withdrawal. I remember his words precisely to this day. 12 years later, in around June of 1993, Begin had risen in the world. He was still working for Shimon Peres, but now as deputy foreign minister. He came to Washington, and in a public setting, we played that question and answer once again. First, let's recall the context. Yitzhak Rabin had campaigned for prime minister in 1992 by promising that he would rapidly make a land for peace deal with the Palestinians. He said he could close the deal within 6 months without negotiating with the terrorist PLO and without agreeing to create what he called a Palestinian mini-state. His idea was to make peace with the non-PLO Palestinian representatives at the Madrid talks. Rabin won the June 1992 election. 6 months then went by, but he was unable to close a land for peace deal. Another 6 months went by, and still no deal with the Palestinians. Officials in his government were embarrassed and frustrated. After a year of fruitless diplomacy, Deputy Foreign Minister Begin was now, in 1993, making a public appearance in Washington. He spoke emotionally about how exasperating it was that Israel hadn't yet made a land for peace deal with the Palestinians. He said everyone knew what the terms of the deal would be, yet it remained out of reach. He said again that Israel had to end the occupation if it's to survive as a Jewish and democratic state. So I raised my hand, and I posed essentially the same question I had asked him a dozen years earlier. If maintaining the occupation is suicidal, how can you say Israel will hold the territories until its enemies agree to make peace promises? Begin reacted as he had before, with a big smile. He complimented the question as the most important issue facing Israel. He said the contradiction I was highlighting was the reason that he supported, and here he spoke slowly, unilateral action. Now that he was deputy minister, he changed the language from unilateral withdrawal to unilateral action. But he clearly hadn't changed his main thought. Around 2 months later, at the end of August in 1993, the first Oslo agreement, known as the Declaration of Principles, was published. There were a few vague words in the preamble about striving for peaceful coexistence. But in the operative part of the DOP, there were no actual peace promises. The Declaration of Principles said simply that Israel would withdraw from parts of the territories and transfer responsibilities to the Arab Party. The Arab Party, labeled the Arab Team representing the Palestinian people, said only that it would take over whatever Israel relinquished. The DOP was an exchange of land for nothing. But after it became public, Arafat wanted Israel to recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. Rabin said he would do that only if Arafat promised peace and renounced terrorism, commitments that were absent from the DOP. The PLO and the Israeli government spent a week and a half negotiating side letters on peace and recognition. During those days, journalists asked Israeli officials what would happen if there were no agreement on the side letters. The officials said the DOP would be implemented anyway. That was revealing. It showed that the Israeli government was determined to make territorial withdrawals whether or not Arafat made a commitment to peace. Yet after the side letters were exchanged, and the DOP signed, Israeli officials changed their story. For 25 years or so, Labor Party leaders had contended that the key to ending the war with the Arabs was a land for peace deal. They blamed Begin, Shamir, and Likud for unwillingness to trade land for peace. Because of this history, the DOP's lack of mutuality was a potential embarrassment. It would likely become a more prominent political problem in Israel over time. But now that they had Arafat's side letter, Israeli officials claimed that Oslo was the very land for peace deal that labor had promised for years. When asked what would happen if Arafat failed to fulfill his peace promises, the official said that Israel's withdrawals would not only stop, but be reversed. That was the opposite of what they had said a few days earlier, in the days after the DOP, but before the side letter. The talk of stopping the Israeli withdrawals, let alone reversing them, was intended to dress up a unilateral Israeli withdrawal and make it look to the Israeli public like a land for peace deal. It may have fooled some Israelis, but it didn't fool Arafat. He understood that the Israeli government simply wanted out, wanted to end the occupation, and was not going to hold him to his peace promises. In any event, he had no intention to terminate the conflict. He had no intention to agree that Israel had a right to exist permanently. He took what Israel was willing to give up, but he didn't make peace. He didn't preach peace. He didn't teach peace in the schools. He didn't enforce peace. Now, let's jump 7 years forward. In 2000, the hopes for Palestinian-Israeli peace were tested and disappointed in the Camp David peace talks, where the principals were President Arafat, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and President Bill Clinton. President Clinton said that Arafat wrecked the talks by insisting that Barak recognize a Palestinian right of return that would effectively destroy Israel. Soon thereafter, in 2001, George W. Bush became president. Arafat had already launched the Second Intifada. Top officials in the new Bush administration disagreed about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Secretary of State Colin Powell promoted standard State Department thinking, which tended to blame Israel for the lack of peace. In contrast, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, Vice President Cheney, and President Bush were skeptical about the conventional wisdom, less trusting of Arafat and more sympathetic to Israel. National Security Advisor Condi Rice initially seemed to position herself in the middle. Powell persuaded the president to call in late 2001 for creation of a Palestinian state. For months thereafter, Powell urged Bush to invite Arafat for a meeting. No such meeting ever took place. The main reasons were, one, the 9/11 attack, which caused President Bush to launch the global war on terrorism, and two, Israel's interception of the Palestinian ship known as the Kareen A with its cargo of Iranian arms. Powell pushed the president repeatedly in national security meetings, where I attended, to meet with Arafat to revive the Oslo process. The vice president opposed Powell. Cheney argued that 9/11 required the US government to take a principled position against terrorism. The Second Intifada was underway. Not only was Arafat failing to prevent terrorism against Israeli civilians, his security forces were often committing terrorist attacks themselves. Then, in January 2002, the Israeli Navy captured the Kareen A and briefed US officials on its cargo of Iranian arms. Israel's defense minister said the shipment violated Oslo. January 2002 was the very month when President Bush spoke about the special danger of countries that both support terrorism and pursue weapons of mass destruction. He called those countries the axis of evil and named Iran as one of them. After Cheney and Rumsfeld saw it, the Kareen A proved that even after 9/11 and the launch of America's global war on terrorism, Arafat remained in bed with America's enemies in Iran. That put the final nail in the coffin of Arafat's reputation as a statesman and peace partner. When I discussed the matter with Secretary Rumsfeld, I told him the story of how the legendary Hollywood movie executive Samuel Goldwyn, who was famous for his broken English, once brushed aside a man he didn't like. Goldwyn said, "Don't pay any attention to him, don't even ignore him." That, I said, should be US policy toward Arafat. Rumsfeld, who had a great sense of humor, laughed out loud when he wrote a memo to President Bush on Arafat. He quoted the Goldwyn remark, and President Bush adopted that as his position on Arafat. As administration officials began focusing attention on the Iraq problem in the spring of 2002, Secretary Powell tried again to persuade Bush to make a personal effort to revive Oslo. He wanted Bush to show sympathy with the Palestinians. He argued that would allow the president to win support on Iraq from Arab leaders. The result of Powell's pressure was President Bush's decision to give a speech on June 24, 2002, on the Arab-Israeli conflict. The speech occupied many weeks of work. Over 30 versions were written. The White House sent successive drafts to Secretary Rumsfeld, and he and I together marked up the drafts, commented on them in a series of memos to the president and to Condi Rice. We explained why Oslo was not a success and warned against investing the president's personal prestige in diplomatic efforts that were not likely to bear fruit. This was the only time I worked side by side with President Bush to compose a speech. The president wanted to deliver an important statement on the Arab-Israeli conflict. We sat together at the table in the Situation Room along with Colin Powell's deputy Richard Armitage and a few others. Armitage said it was important for the president to mention the Oslo final status issues. The president said no. Armitage pressed the point. Again, the president refused. Armitage warned that the failure to do so would endanger the progress on those issues made over the years. President Bush clearly did not like being badgered. He answered Armitage sharply. I remember his words. "I'm not going to climb back into the Oslo rut," President Bush said, and then added, with emphasis, "I want to change the way people think about the Arab-Israeli conflict." Now, the heart of that June 24th speech that President Bush delivered was the following comments from the speech. "Peace requires a new and different Palestinian leadership so that a Palestinian state can be born. I call on the Palestinian people to elect new leaders, leaders not compromised by terror." Bush said, "When the Palestinian people have new leaders, new institutions, and new security arrangements with their neighbors, the United States of America will support the creation of a Palestinian state whose borders and certain aspects of its sovereignty will be provisional until resolved as part of a final settlement in the Middle East." Close quote. That speech broke new ground. It moved beyond the fruitless question of whether peace produces security or security produces peace. Rather, it directed attention to the essential problem. The Palestinians need better leaders and new political institutions. Until they get them, President Bush understood, peace would remain unachievable. This was not just a thought that some speechwriter put into President Bush's mouth. It was an analysis that he developed personally through extensive consultation with his advisors. He became intensely involved in the drafting and redrafting of his pronouncement. And one consequence was that he resolved never to meet Arafat and never did. What happened after the June 24th, 2002 speech is a cautionary tale about bureaucratic politics. I hope you could just bear with me. I may need a minute or two beyond my allotted time, if it's okay. In particular, it's a story about how hard it is for a US president to impose his will on the government. If foreign officials hope to operate effectively in Washington, they should understand this point. Once he gave his June 24th speech, President Bush didn't want to devote substantial personal time anymore to the Arab-Israeli matters, at least not until he had taken whatever actions he was going to take against Saddam Hussein. The National Security Advisor said that Secretary Powell would resume control over Arab-Israeli peace diplomacy. The Powell-Armitage team had lost almost all the major battles in the drafting of the June 24th speech. So what did they do? They ignored the speech. They revived the Oslo process by launching what they called the roadmap for Palestinian-Israeli peace diplomacy. They were able to do this because Israeli officials never complained about Oslo's resurrection. The Israelis had likewise chosen to ignore what President Bush said. I met at the Pentagon and in Israel with a series of senior Israeli officials. I drew their attention to President Bush's key point, that the United States and Israel shared an interest in the development of a new Palestinian political leadership. I asked Israeli officials what their plans for responding to that point were. Were they devising a strategy for working with the United States and others to influence Palestinian society and incentivize the rise of leaders that were actually interested in improving the lives of their people? Time and again, Israeli officials told me that they were not aware of any such strategy on Prime Minister Sharon's part. Instead, Israeli officials plunged into the roadmap. I met with the top official in the Prime Minister's office, who shall remain nameless, and noted for him the differences between the roadmap and the ideas President Bush spelled out in his June 24th speech. The roadmap was Oslo all over again, but the president's speech urged efforts to transform the region by cultivating new Palestinian leaders not compromised by terror. This Israeli official sounded confused and defensive. We deal with the State Department, he said, because state represents the United States. That's true, of course, in a sense, but it's not an excuse for Israel to ignore the president's own words. I shifted this official's focus to recent Israeli history. A few years back, Yitzhak Shamir was prime minister and Shimon Peres was foreign minister. I asked, if an American wanted to work with the Israeli government, would it have made sense to operate on the assumption that its only relevant voice was Peres? The Israeli said, no, of course not. He said, everyone knew that Shamir and Peres didn't agree at all. I said, everyone knew that, presumably because Israel is a superpower, studied closely by officials of governments around the world. The United States, in contrast, is just a small provincial state. And no one can be expected to realize that there are profound differences between state and White House officials. I don't think my sarcasm was effective. In any case, the Sharon government continued to devote energy to the so-called roadmap, which was a warmed-over Oslo process. It never developed a strategy for working with the United States to influence the rise of better Palestinian leaders. It never even pretended to take seriously the views that President Bush presented in his June 24th speech. Why that was the case is a question I hope our discussions today will help explain. Meanwhile, to conclude, Trump administration officials seem to have absorbed thoroughly the key insights of that Bush speech. They are challenging long-standing conventional wisdom about Arab-Israeli peacemaking. This is clear in many ways. They moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, they denounced Hamas violence without equivocation, they supported the Taylor Force Act and punished the Palestinian Authority financially for giving salaries and benefits to imprisoned and martyred terrorists. They are cutting funds for the UN Relief and Works Agency, whose main purpose is not to aid refugees, but to perpetuate the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And they are now reported to be exploring ways to increase the influence in Palestinian affairs of neighboring Arab states, such as Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. This time, the unconventional approach of US officials is well received by top Israeli officials, by and large. If the approach is successful, the Palestinians may find themselves with a new political picture, new institutions, and perhaps a better leadership. That's the optimistic view. It may take many years to produce the needed changes, but if they occur, the Palestinians would be better off. And unlike during the Oslo process, Israel might have a Palestinian partner willing to make peace with it. Thank you.